Hello, today we are talking about the novel Jane Eyre's main heroine, naming Jane Eyre, as Jane Eyre is the center that holds the novel together, substantive. Jane Eyre is the heroine of the novel. She was an orphan who was fostered in Gateshead Hall by her aunt, Mrs. Reed. Though her aunt had made a promise to look after a girl just like her own children, but she was neglected and ill-treated. Only the nurse basis was kind of her. Mrs. Reed her children avoided her company. Her son John was apathetic to her. He always insulted her, used to beat her, and also complained against innocent Jane to his mother. She behaved cruelly towards Jane and never believed what Jane said. Son's words were granted as truth, and misfortune fell on Jane. The most tragic experience for the child Jane was when she was beaten by Joan and was victimized to be locked in the spare room in which Mrs. Reed had died. She was horrified inside, sobbed there, was afraid of a white figure and laid unconscious. It was a shocking experience for her. She was to learn, as Basis said, you ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligation of Mrs. Reed. She speaks you. If she were to turn you would have to go to the poor house. Inside the red room, she felt as kept in the jail. Bessis told her even stories which soothed. Otherwise, John reads violently. Terence and his sister proud indifference. His mother aversions. The particularly disturbed her mind. She was condemned by all the people at the gate shed. Mr. Lloyd sympathized with her and suggested to send her to school. Jane also liked the idea and thought that was hope for new life. Mr. Lloyd talks about it to Mrs. Reed. She called her in Mr. Blockhurst and Jeans left Gateshead Hall for Lowood. Then she was in a sad but hopeful mood to reach a new place. She liked the Lowood institution and his superintendent, Miss Maria Temple. She was much impressed with Miss Temple's affectionate behavior. She had a grace of heart and helped needy students. For the Jane, she became a model role to follow. After marriage, Miss Temple left the school. It was the great missing of source of guidance for Jane, as now she missed not only the ideal teacher but friend and the guardian too. Helen Burn's death caused a great loss to Jane because she was her most intimate companion and Lowood. She had a good and pleasing nature which was liked by Jane. Later, Mary Ann Wilson was also a good company. Particularly, her skill of narration was quite appealing to the Jane. Jane's stay at the school and the scrupulous nature proved useful. After schooling, she started her career as a teacher at Lowood. Her life had been monotonous for 8 years as a student and for 2 years as a teacher. Then she thought of becoming a governess, advertiser for it, and got a job at Thornfield. Joining as a governess proved a turning point in her life. She grew intimacy with the her master, Mr. Rochester, he was also equally interested in her. Both came closer. The first meeting was made when Jane was returning from hay and Mr. Rochester had his horse fell on the ground. Jane helped the master, though she had treated him as a stranger, as she did not know that he was her master. The same he also not knew her incidental paved a path for love and love to grow between the two. He praises her three paintings which she had prepared when she lived in Lowood. Rochester's words were, "You excite in a kind of artist's dreamland." Jean's opinion about the picture was to paint them was to enjoy one of the keenest pleasure I have ever known. Jane felt inferior before the master for the encouraged her to be an friendly term with him. He expressed, "In time, I think you would be natural with me." It was Jane's first experience that she lived a free life in a private house apart. Mr. Rochester was her master and she was only an employee. So it was not an easy thing to behave on the some uh, pedestal, but her heart became fond of him, and later the status problem did not exist any longer. It was strange that Mr. Rochester had enjoyed her secretary and about the night dwelling, which were accused on the name of Grace Poole, but it was disclosed only a Jane. Why so? Jane was puzzled to think, but could not understand why should it not be revealed to others. Later, Jane longed for Mr. Rochester's company. He had gone to participate in the highborn people's party at the Lees. Perhaps Mr. Fairfax could guess that Jane and the master had grown love for each other. She treated it as Jane's folly and commented, "Cover your head and be ashamed." He said something in praise of your eyes. Did he? Blind puppy, open their blared lids and look on your own accursed senses. Lesson. It does good to know a woman be flattered by her superior, who possibly can not intended to marry her. Mrs. Fairfax's sensible advice went heeded as Jane's love and had grown intense, and Mr. Rochester also loved her deeply. The two might think of a marriage on the ground of love. Then a party was organized at Thornfield. Jane was delighted to see such a group of people becoming belonging to the high society. Mr. Rochester shows deep attachment with the Miss Blanche Ingram. It was done only to grow jealousy in Jane's heart. When Jane felt neglected and seemed depressed, Mr. Rochester said to her, "So long as my visitors stay, I expect you to appear in the drawing room every evening. It is my wish." He had said to simply to encourage and gladden her to enjoy the company in the party. When the pantomime was played, Miss Ingram became Mr. Rochester's partner, and when it ended, he said to her, "You are my wife. We were married an hour since, in presence of all these witnesses. It was only a spectacle." Jane had liked Mr. Rochester's role play as old woman. She was pleased to learn about her future because the prediction were made on the basis of the present. The only thing that learned from the old woman made her anxious was that Jane's fortune was yet doubtful. Then Jane had to leave for Gateshead to meet her aunt and was on her deathbed. When she reached her there, she learned of her uncle's will in her favor. During her stay there, she was informed that Mr. Rochester had planned to marry soon. It was conjectured to be with Mr. Ingram. When Jane came back to Thornfield, she felt the situation intentionally not in her favor, but later so much favorable that she was to be married with Mr. Rochester. The marriage was stopped because of an interruption made by a solicitor from London, Mr. Briggs. It was done because Mr. Rochester had a wife living at Thornfield. She was a mad woman. Her husband confessed, but it was heart-rending for Jane. All was over for love. Jane was in a fix. Her words were, "I have weakened out of most glorious dreams and found them all void and vain. In is a horror. I could be a master, but that I must leave him decidedly, intensely, entirely is the intolerable. I cannot do it." They both expressed their mutual love, but the circumstances had turned adverse. Mr. Rochester said to her, "It is you, a spirit with will and energy, and virtue and purity that I want, not alone your brittle flame." Jane had a with thought of time. She was compelled by the circumstances to leave the Thornfield, but the hard desire. Ultimately, she overpowered her emotions and felt Thornfield and Rochester. She ran away and reached on Wiscross from the Moor House. There too, she had to face a mental crisis. She did not forget Mr. Rochester's love, but St. John wanted to marry her at Whitecross. She had believed not a tie hold to me to human society at this moment, not a charm or hope calls me where my fellow creatures are. None that saw me would have a kind thought of or a good wish for him. Now it was that she felt that she had no social ties, but when St. John made a proposal to marriage to her, she remembered Mr. Rochester deeply. She became a school mistress. She got plentiful amount, which was banqueted by her uncle, but her heart longed only for Mr. Rochester. Jane rushed to Thornfield, but found it ruined. When she learned of her master's present plight, he reached Manor House and married with him and lived happily. In this way, Jane's character is revealed as of a woman who had suffered since her childhood days. She was a wise person, full of uprightness and confidence. Her ardent love for Mr. Rochester became a synonym of life. Charlotte Bronte is depicted as a splendid character which find a unique place in the English fiction. Thank you.